Steel groaned beneath his boots, a mechanical heartbeat pulsing through the armored beast. Oberstleutnant Bauer surveyed his domain, Hitler's armored train slicing through Polish countryside like an invincible blade. The Reich had promised him impenetrable, unstoppable. Then came the shadow dance across frozen fields, the thunder from above that no armor could withstand. His fortress had become his coffin. Subscribe to witness the moment when German engineering met American skies and learned that power crawling on earth cannot hide from death raining from heaven. Oberstleutnant Friedrich Bauer stood rigidly at the command car's viewport, watching Poland's war-ravaged countryside blur past the armored train's impenetrable skin. His gloved fingers traced the reinforced glass, 12 centimeters thick, they told him, capable of withstanding direct small arms fire. Behind him, 20 hand-picked men monitored communications, tracked Allied movements, and maintained the beating heart of what the Führer himself had called Germany's mobile fortress. Outside, January winds whipped snow against the steel beast, the rhythmic clacking of wheels on tracks, a mechanical heartbeat that had become so familiar these past months that Bauer noticed it only when it changed tempo or hesitated over damaged rails. The America, as the crew had unofficially christened this particular armored train, represented the pinnacle of German defensive engineering, a 200-meter behemoth of reinforced steel, mounted weapons, and mobile command capabilities. Friedrich had been selected personally by Berlin to command it, a fact that still swelled his chest with pride despite the increasingly desperate tide of war. 3 modified Flak 38 anti-aircraft guns crowned the artillery car, flanked by machine gun nests embedded in rotating steel turrets. The locomotive itself wore a carapace of layered steel plates, angled to deflect incoming fire. A rolling fortress indeed, invulnerable to partisans, resistant to sabotage, and faster than any ground force that might wish to intercept it. Friedrich's aide, Lieutenant Weber, approached with the day's communication log, breaking the commander's reverie. "Headquarters confirms our schedule, Herr Oberstleutnant. We'll reach Krakow by nightfall, barring partisan interference." The younger man's voice carried the familiar tension they all felt moving through these territories. Even with their impressive armaments, the forests and hills surrounding the tracks concealed 1,000 eyes, watching, waiting for any vulnerability. That's why they needed the America, to move officers, documents, and critical supplies through increasingly hostile territory without fear of ambush. On paper, the design was flawless, a testament to German engineering and foresight. "Very good, Weber. And the reconnaissance reports?" Friedrich took the clipboard, scanning the notations with practiced efficiency. Supply lines were stretching thinner each week as the Eastern Front devoured men and material with insatiable hunger. The Russian winter had proven as deadly as Russian bullets, and now the Western Allies were pressing from the opposite direction. Yet here, within the America's armored shell, a fragile bubble of order remained. Friedrich had maintained his pre-war standards: pressed uniforms, polished boots, precise schedules. "Control what you can control," his father had taught him. "The rest is in God's hands," though such sentiments were better left unspoken in the new Germany. Weber hesitated before answering, a fraction of a pause that immediately caught Friedrich's attention. 3 Allied bombing runs reported near Watch last night, Herr Oberstleutnant. Heavy formations, B-17s most likely. The information hung between them, seemingly innocuous, yet laden with unspoken implications. The armored train's primary weakness had always been aerial attack, a vulnerability that had seemed theoretical until recent months when Allied air superiority had become undeniable. The flak guns were adequate against low-flying aircraft, but against high-altitude bombers flying in formation, they were little more than noisemakers, a psychological comfort rather than effective deterrence. Friedrich handed back the clipboard without comment, returning his gaze to the snow-covered landscape flowing past the viewport. There had been a time, not so long ago, when the sight of this magnificent machine rolling through conquered territories had inspired awe and fear in equal measure. Now, as reports from every front spoke of retreat and defensive actions, he found himself calculating new equations. How many bombs would it take to derail the America? How visible were they from 5,000 meters above? Could the reinforced command car withstand a near miss? Questions without satisfactory answers. Mathematical certainties that transformed his pride into something colder. The invincible fortress had developed invisible cracks, not in its armor, but in the strategic reality that surrounded it. Friedrich watched his breath fog the bulletproof glass as night began to fall across the Polish countryside, their iron serpents slithering onward, powerful and vulnerable all at once. The war room aboard the America hummed with activity as maps were updated and intelligence reports filtered in through the crackling radio. Friedrich studied the regional overview spread across the central table, its surface illuminated by hanging lamps that swayed gently with the train's motion. Red pins marked known Allied air bases. Blue lines traced probable flight paths. Yellow circles indicated recent bombing targets. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone willing to see it. A methodical, industrial approach to warfare that reduced cities to coordinates and human lives to acceptable loss calculations. America's factories produced bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down. Britain's airfields launched waves of aircraft day and night, overwhelming through sheer volume what they couldn't overcome through tactical superiority. 2,000 sorties last week alone, Herr Oberstleutnant, reported Major Hoffmann, their intelligence officer, a man whose increasingly haggard appearance betrayed the strain of delivering consistently worsening news. Conservative estimates put their bomb tonnage at 3 times our monthly production capacity. His finger traced the map, where dozens of yellow circles clustered around railway junctions, factories, and supply depots. They're systematically dismantling our transportation infrastructure. Railways are priority targets. The unspoken conclusion hung in the air. Massive armored trains like the America weren't just vulnerable, they were prime targets, concentrated industrial value moving on predictable paths. Friedrich absorbed the information without visible reaction, though internally he calculated their odds with the cold precision mathematics had always afforded him. 30 German armored trains distributed across thousands of kilometers of front lines and occupied territories. Against them, thousands of Allied aircraft dropping millions of kilograms of explosives. The equation was brutally simple, the outcome increasingly inevitable. The Reich had built its defensive strategy around symbols of power, impregnable Atlantic wall fortifications, massive Tiger tanks, sleek U-boats prowling the depths. But America had built its offensive capability on the principles of mass production, overwhelming volume, and the simple understanding that enough of anything could overcome even the most sophisticated opposition. "Have we received updated flak ammunition allocations?" Friedrich asked, his voice steady despite the grim arithmetic playing out in his mind. The question caused a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, officers exchanging glances before Hoffmann responded. The answer confirmed what Friedrich already suspected. Their anti-aircraft capability was more theoretical than practical. Limited ammunition, limited range, limited effectiveness against high-altitude bombers. The America's imposing flak guns were impressive to ground forces and civilian populations, but little more than gestures of defiance against the air fleets now dominating European skies. Each shell fired skyward represented precious resources diverted from other fronts, a diminishing return on investment that Berlin nonetheless insisted upon maintaining. Night had fallen completely by the time Friedrich retired to his private quarters, a Spartan compartment that nonetheless offered luxury compared to frontline conditions. He removed his jacket methodically, folding it with precision born of decades of military discipline. On his small desk sat a framed photograph of his wife and daughter in Munich, smiling from a summer day that seemed to belong to another lifetime entirely. Beside it lay his personal logbook, where he recorded observations too candid for official reports. He opened it now, pen hovering over the blank page as he considered the day's calculations. The America carried 60 men, mounted 12 significant weapons, weighed nearly 500 tons, and traveled at a maximum speed of 80 kilometers per hour. Against it, a single Allied bombing formation could deliver 30 aircraft, each carrying multiple 1,000-kilogram bombs, traveling at 300 kilometers per hour at an altitude well beyond effective flak range. Friedrich began to write, his neat handwriting filling the page with observations that would be considered defeatist in official channels. The simple truth was that their impressive war machine represented the wrong solution for the evolving problem. Germany had built weapons to fight the previous war, dominating territory, controlling ground movement, establishing fixed positions of strength. But this war had evolved beyond such concepts, reaching literally above them. The mathematical certainty of it all carried its own kind of peace, like accepting the inevitability of winter after fall. No amount of genius engineering could overcome the fundamental equation. The ground could be armored, but the sky was open, and what came from above would eventually reach what waited below. The train swayed gently as it rounded a bend, steel wheels on steel rails, producing a rhythmic cadence that had once seemed powerful, but now struck Friedrich as vulnerable. A predictable path that any aerial navigator could follow with minimal effort. He closed his logbook and extinguished his lamp, lying in darkness as the America continued its journey through occupied Poland. A magnificent anachronism rolling inexorably toward a future where such machines would be remembered only as curious relics of an outmoded way of thinking about warfare. Dawn broke reluctantly over the frost-covered Polish landscape, weak January sunlight filtering through a patchwork of low clouds. Friedrich had been awake for hours, sleep having abandoned him sometime in the night as the America made its scheduled stop at a small refueling depot 20 kilometers outside Krakow. The brief pause in their journey allowed crew members to stretch their legs on solid ground, though Friedrich noted how they instinctively glanced skyward every few minutes, a new habit formed by men who understood their vulnerability. The morning air carried a brittle chill that penetrated even the heavy wool of his greatcoat as he supervised the refueling operation from the relative safety of the platform, maintaining the appearance of confident command while inwardly calculating how long they would remain stationary, exposed. The station master, a thin Polish man with eyes that carefully revealed nothing, presented requisition papers with trembling hands. Friedrich signed them without comment, conscious of the local workers watching from a distance, their gazes a mixture of fear and barely concealed hatred. These conquered peoples understood something that Berlin seemed increasingly unable to grasp, that occupation required constant vigilance, that every kilometer of track through these territories represented not just a supply line, but a vulnerability. The armored train might be impervious to their sabotage attempts, but the tracks themselves remained susceptible, and the partisans grew bolder with each passing month as news of Soviet advances and Allied bombing campaigns filtered through even the most strictly controlled information networks. 15 minutes until departure, Herr Oberstleutnant, Lieutenant Weber reported, his breath forming clouds in the morning air. Friedrich nodded acknowledgement, his attention caught by a peculiar sound, or rather, the absence of sound. The birds had stopped singing. He tilted his head slightly, years of battlefield experience having taught him to trust such instinctive observations. The sudden silence hung heavy over the station, broken only by the mechanical sounds of the refueling operation and the low conversations of his men. Something had disturbed the natural rhythm of the morning. Something the local wildlife had detected before human senses could register it. Friedrich scanned the horizon, squinting against the low winter sun, now breaking through the cloud cover in golden shafts that illuminated patches of the snow-covered landscape. "Complete refueling immediately and prepare for immediate departure," he ordered, his voice betraying none of the unease prickling along his spine. Weber looked momentarily confused, but knew better than to question a direct order. As the young officer hurried to relay the command, Friedrich continued to study the brightening sky, now clear of clouds in the east, where the sun continued its slow ascent. The weather was improving, favorable conditions for flying. The realization settled in his stomach like lead. Perfect visibility meant vulnerable railways. He had studied enough Allied bombing patterns to understand their preference for clear conditions when targeting transportation infrastructure. The America, temporarily stationary during refueling, represented an ideal target if any reconnaissance aircraft had spotted them during the night. The increased urgency of the crew's movements reflected their understanding of the commander's concern without requiring explicit explanation. Years of war had attuned them to survival's subtle language. Steel scraped against steel as the refueling equipment was hastily disconnected, and the locomotive's engines roared to life with greater urgency than usual, black smoke belching from its armored stack. Friedrich maintained his position on the platform until the last possible moment, still scanning the increasingly clear sky, the silence of the birds now joined by a different quality of stillness, the peculiar dead calm that often preceded violence, a phenomenon he had experienced on dozens of battlefields across Europe. Friedrich boarded the command car just as the America lurched forward, steel wheels grinding against rails as the massive machine gradually built momentum. He moved directly to the communications center, where radio operators monitored all frequencies. "Any reports of aerial activity in this sector?" he demanded, shedding his greatcoat and gloves. The operators exchanged glances before the senior radio man responded, "Nothing reported, Herr Oberstleutnant, but there's increased Allied chatter on multiple bands. Something's happening, but we can't determine what." Friedrich nodded grimly. The enemy had become increasingly sophisticated in their communication security, often maintaining radio silence until the moment of attack. By the time German monitoring stations detected and decoded their transmissions, bombs would already be falling. As the armored train gathered speed, pushing east toward Krakow, Friedrich returned to his position at the command viewport. The morning had fully bloomed now, revealing a crystalline blue sky stretching from horizon to horizon without a single cloud. Beautiful, treacherous visibility. Perfect weather for the hunters who ruled the skies, and the America was crawling across open country on predetermined rails, unable to deviate, unable to hide. Despite the massive locomotive's growing speed, Friedrich couldn't escape the sensation that they were actually standing still, pinned against the earth like an insect on display, waiting for the shadow that would inevitably fall across them from above. The mathematics of their situation remained unchanged, the equations still balanced in favor of those who commanded the air. He watched a lone bird finally return to flight, a dark speck against the perfect blue, free in a way his iron fortress could never be. By midday, the America had reached its maximum operational speed, hurtling through the Polish countryside with a thunderous determination that vibrated through every metal plate and rivet. Friedrich had ordered all available power diverted to the engines, prioritizing speed over comfort in a tacit acknowledgement of their vulnerability. The command car bustled with increased activity as radio operators monitored all frequencies with renewed vigilance. Maps were continuously updated, and the gunners at their flak positions remained on high alert, scanning the brilliant blue sky that had become as much a threat as a canopy. Friedrich moved between stations with measured calm, his exterior betraying none of the calculations ceaselessly running through his mind, distances, probabilities, scenarios playing out in mathematical precision. Radiogram from Krakow Command, Herr Oberstleutnant, announced the senior communications officer, extending a freshly decoded message. Friedrich took the paper, scanning its contents with practiced efficiency. Allied bombing formations had been detected moving eastward from bases in Italy, their likely targets listed as transportation hubs in southern Poland. Krakow railway station appeared prominently among the projected targets. The message concluded with revised orders. The America was to divert to a secondary rail line leading northeast, avoiding the city entirely. Friedrich's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. The alternative route would take them through more exposed terrain, away from the anti-aircraft batteries protecting major cities. Strategic retreat disguised as tactical repositioning, a pattern becoming all too familiar in recent months. "Acknowledge receipt and confirm course correction," Friedrich instructed, returning the radiogram to the officer. "Inform the engineer to prepare for the junction diversion 15 kilometers ahead." As the order was relayed, Friedrich moved to the tactical map table where Major Hoffmann was already adjusting their planned route with red grease pencil, marking the alternative track with hesitant strokes that suggested his own misgivings about the new course. "The northeast line hasn't been properly maintained since last summer," Hoffmann noted quietly, for Friedrich's ears alone. "We'll need to reduce speed by at least 30%. The implication hung between them. Slower movement, longer exposure. Friedrich nodded once, accepting the new calculation with the same stoic pragmatism with which he had accepted so many other deteriorating variables in recent months. The first indication came not as a sight, but as a sound, or rather a change in sound. Friedrich noticed it immediately, a subtle alteration in the acoustic environment inside the command car. The constant background noise of the America's movement, steel wheels on rails, the throbbing engines, the mechanical systems, seemed to shift frequency almost imperceptibly. Some of the younger officers continued their work oblivious, but Friedrich observed how the veterans among them had also paused, heads tilting slightly, senses attuned to the change. Years of warfare had conditioned them to recognize the atmospheric pressure variations that preceded artillery barrages or aerial bombardment. Something was displacing air molecules above them, something substantial and approaching. Friedrich moved swiftly to the armored viewport, eyes searching the perfect blue expanse. Initially, he saw nothing but unblemished sky. Then, at the very limit of human vision, tiny specks appeared, too numerous and too precisely arranged to be birds. Black dots against blue infinity, maintaining perfect formation as they approached from the southwest. The America's early warning system erupted in a cacophony of alarms moments later, confirmation coming too late of what experienced eyes had already detected. "American bombers, high altitude, approaching bearing 240, shouted the lookout from the observation bubble. B-17s, at least 30 aircraft. The calm of the command car shattered as officers rushed to stations. Friedrich remained still at the viewport, watching the approaching formation with a detached fascination that surprised even him. The mathematical certainty of what was coming carried its own strange peace. "Sound general alarm. All flak crews to positions. Maximum speed maintained," Friedrich ordered, his voice cutting through the growing chaos with practiced authority. He turned to find Weber awaiting instructions, the young man's face composed, but eyes betraying the fear they all felt. "Have the engineer identified the nearest tunnel or covered position along our route?" Weber nodded sharply and disappeared toward the communications array as the America's alarm system wailed throughout the train, men rushing to battle stations with disciplined urgency. The massive flak guns mounted on the artillery car would be elevating now, their crews loading the precious few rounds allocated for each weapon, preparing to launch their token resistance against an enemy that flew beyond their effective range. Friedrich returned his gaze to the approaching bombers, now clearly visible as they methodically closed the distance. Perfect formation, perfect coordination. The industrial efficiency of American war production manifested in synchronized flight. He had studied the B-17 specifications extensively, each aircraft carrying up to 2 tons of bombs, flying at altitudes approaching 8,000 meters, protected by multiple machine gun positions and flying in formations specifically designed to create overlapping fields of fire. Against such aerial precision, the America's impressive ground capabilities seemed suddenly archaic, like bringing a medieval shield to face modern artillery. The mathematics remained coldly absolute. 30 bombers, potentially 60 tons of explosives, against one train confined to predetermined tracks. As the distance closed, Friedrich experienced a moment of perfect clarity, the recognition that technology had rendered obsolete not just their armored train, but an entire philosophy of warfare. The ground could be conquered, territory could be held, but the sky remained free, and those who commanded it could strike at will against those bound to earth. He watched the bomb bay doors open in synchronized precision across the formation, dark rectangles appearing beneath the silver aircraft. The America's flak guns began firing, their reports reverberating through the armored shell of the command car, futile gestures against targets well beyond their range. Friedrich stood motionless at the viewport, bearing witness to the inevitable conclusion of an equation that had been solved long before this moment, as the first bombs began their long descent toward the rails that both guided and imprisoned his iron fortress. The world contracted to a sequence of sensory impressions, time stretching like heated metal as Friedrich watched the first wave of bombs detach from the distant aircraft. They didn't fall so much as they seemed to hover, suspended momentarily against the perfect blue, before gravity asserted its inevitable claim. The flak guns continued their defiant chorus, black puffs of exploded shells appearing thousands of meters below the American formation, symbolic resistance rather than effective deterrence. Inside the command car, the ordered chaos of battle stations continued, men performing their duties with mechanical precision even as they understood the fundamental futility of their actions. Friedrich remained at his post, watching mathematics manifest as physics, the elegant simplicity of mass and velocity about to intersect with their position on predetermined rails. The initial impacts occurred approximately 800 meters ahead of the America's position, tremendous explosions erupting on either side of the tracks in a choreographed sequence that suggested deliberate bracketing. Earth, stone, and twisted metal launched skyward as the shockwaves rolled across the landscape toward them. Friedrich braced himself against the command console as the first tremors reached the train, rattling windows and causing instruments to shudder in their housings. "Direct hit on the tracks ahead!" shouted the forward observer, his voice tight with controlled panic. The engineer responded immediately, brake systems engaging with a screaming protest of metal against metal. Friedrich felt the deceleration force him forward as the massive machine fought against its own momentum, slowing but still moving inexorably toward the newly created crater where tracks had existed moments before. "Second wave, approaching target." The warning barely registered before the next sequence of explosions erupted, closer now, the impacts walking methodically toward their position with industrial precision. The America shuddered violently as near misses sent shockwaves through the ground beneath the rails. Dust and smoke enveloped the viewports, temporarily blinding them to the destruction outside. Friedrich gripped the edge of the map table as the floor bucked beneath him, instruments and equipment tearing free from wall mountings to become dangerous projectiles within the confines of the command car. A junior officer cried out as a communications unit crashed into his shoulder, the sound barely audible above the cacophony of explosions and the train's own mechanical protests as it continued its increasingly desperate deceleration. Through the chaos, Friedrich maintained his analytical detachment, observing with clinical precision how the American bombing pattern demonstrated textbook execution. Methodical, thorough, designed to ensure target destruction through overwhelming volume rather than individual accuracy. No single bomb needed to score a direct hit. The mathematics of probability ensured that among dozens of explosives, enough would land sufficiently close to sever tracks, disable engines, or breach armor. The strategy required no brilliant tactical innovations, merely the industrial capacity to produce aircraft and bombs in quantities that transformed probability into certainty. Quantity had its own quality, as Soviet generals were fond of observing. The America, for all its impressive engineering and imposing presence, represented a limited resource that could not be quickly replaced, while American factories produced B-17s by the thousands. The locomotive finally ground to a complete halt, its massive form still trembling with mechanical strain and the continuing vibrations from nearby impacts. The sudden silence of the engines created a momentary acoustic vacuum, quickly filled by the distant drone of aircraft engines and the closer sounds of settling debris and injured men. Friedrich straightened his uniform through ingrained habit and moved purposefully toward the communications station. "Damage reports from all sections," he ordered, his voice cutting through the stunned atmosphere that had descended upon the command car. Around him, officers gradually resumed their duties, though their movements now carried the hesitant quality of men operating in unfamiliar territory, the territory of defeat. Reports filtered in through crackling intercoms and breathless messengers. The forward sections had suffered the worst damage. The armored locomotive's boiler breached, 3 crew members severely injured. The tracks ahead completely destroyed for at least 500 meters, with additional cratering making repair work nearly impossible without substantial engineering support. One flak position had taken a near-direct hit, the gun crew's status unknown. Friedrich absorbed each piece of information with outward stoicism, mentally calculating their increasingly limited options. The America, designed to project power and security across occupied territories, had been effectively neutralized not through any failure of its impressive armor, but by simply removing the infrastructure upon which it depended. The flying fortresses above had rendered his ground fortress immobile, not by destroying it directly, but by destroying its context, its environment, its fundamental premise. Friedrich moved to the rear viewport, gazing back along the length of the armored train that had represented the pinnacle of German defensive engineering. From this new perspective, with smoke and dust clearing in patches, he could see how vulnerable it appeared. A massive linear target stretched across the landscape, confined to tracks that both supported and condemned it. The Allies hadn't needed to penetrate its impressive armor. They had simply changed the terms of engagement, attacking not the fortress itself, but the ground upon which it stood. Through the dissipating smoke, he could still make out the American formation, now turning westward, their mission completed with mechanical efficiency. Each aircraft represented not just a weapons platform, but a philosophical statement about the changing nature of warfare. That control of territory meant nothing without control of the skies above it. As Friedrich watched the distant bombers disappear toward the horizon, a cold clarity settled over him, the mathematician's appreciation for an elegant solution to a complex problem. The America had indeed been untouchable on paper, its specifications impressive, its capabilities formidable against any ground-based threat. But war wasn't fought on paper, and no amount of armor could create a ceiling over Poland high enough to protect against what came from above. He turned back to face his officers, men trained in the doctrine of ground superiority, now confronting its obsolescence in real time. "Send to headquarters. America immobilized. Awaiting recovery team. Position increasingly vulnerable to follow-up air attack." The message was factual, devoid of emotion or excuse, a soldier's acknowledgement that the mathematics of modern warfare had rendered their iron serpent helpless beneath the empty sky where America's fortresses ruled unopposed.